let's go into a little bit of we saw that the biology seems to interact with all this information, and it seems to confirm a lot of the information. So we can come at it from different perspectives. And one of the perspectives I was coming at it from is the geometric perspective, obviously. And I was playing with the interaction of the spheres interacting. If you put a sphere around each tetrahedron of vector equilibrium, they will intersect. Or if you put a sphere around each tetrahedron of a star tetrahedron, they will intersect. The intersection pattern looks like this. It looks like petals or lobes. Interestingly, the lobes, vertices, match the vertices of the octahedron cavity inside the metric. That is, they don't fall at weird angles or anything. They just fall directly at the vertices of the geometry. So now you have curved space interacting with linear geometric space. And I start to ask myself these questions, like, what are these lobe-type structures? Now, let's go back in time. I was still in my van. This was like 4 years later, right? Still studying, and I was reading a lot of physics about waveforms and so on, and it was really intriguing, but it was giving me a lot of headaches. And I was getting headaches because when you look at those things, waves, they typically are represented as a sine wave, right? Something in this fashion. And we are given in general that this is the wave frequency, the wave amplitude, and the wavelength. And that's basically the parameters we describe in wave dynamics. And I was getting a headache. And I couldn't figure it out. I was like not able to visualize these waves. I was trying to visualize my view of the universe and to like see how the wave dynamics kind of fall into it. How does that all interact and where it all fits in? And I didn't quite understand what a wave was, and so I was trying to read up on it, and I was getting more and more confused. And eventually I just said, okay, I got to kind of go back to the basics. And so I drove my van up to Alpine Lake in Canada, where you have those turquoise Alpine Lake inside inside a mountains range, so it's very calm. And I grabbed a bunch of pebbles, and I was sitting on a branch on the side of the lake, throwing pebbles in the lake, going, okay, how are these waves working, And I'm looking at these rings coming off the surface and all this, and it's kind of a simple approach, but I was kind of visualizing it. And I could see that if I took the waveform on the surface of the water and I sheared them, or if I divided them, I could see that it would generate this pattern, this waveform. But I thought, well, this is kind of an artificial way of looking at it because, the rock is sinking. It hits the surface tension of the water, and then it pushes the molecules out, and then this wave comes out. And I thought, well, you have to account that the rock has to sink in order for the wave to happen. So how do I account for that? And I was getting confused, and I couldn't understand it all together. And then I thought, but wait a minute, and I thought, if the rock is sinking and the wave is being produced, then it's like more like a vortex. And when I thought of that, it hit me. Oh, wait a minute. I'm thinking in 2 dimensions. You see how that flat two-dimensional planes get you? You know, that Euclidean flat space? Well, in this way, we think of waves as like, traces on an oscilloscope or something like that. But actually, a wave is a three-dimensional vortex. I realized, oh my God, if this was in 3D, this would be a vortex along an axis of rotation. And it hit me, oh my God, waves are 3D things. We live in a 3D world. It's not a flat thing. Flatness does not exist. There's no such thing. That's a concept of man, not a fundamental structure of nature. Euclidean flat space are irrelevant to nature. And so I totally got it, and I thought, oh yeah. So, when you think of I looked at the sun and I thought, oh my God, I don't know how many times I thought of a waveform leaving the sun and coming towards me doing this up and down thing. And it's like, not anything in the universe does up and down. It rotates, it spins. And so a waveform coming off the sun is a vortex that's touching me, that's hitting my eyes, that so on. And I realized that this was fundamental. That we commonly, and if you ask a physicist, he'll tell you, oh yeah, it's a 3D vortex, but we don't think of it that way. I mean, if he's well educated, he'll know that. No. And we don't think of it this way because it's too complex. We flatten it up so that okay, but if you flatten it up, now you don't have angular momentum. You don't have the spin dynamics of the geometry of space, that generate the vortex in the first place. So I was like, oh, okay. So I'm thinking about all this and I'm getting excited about it. And I laid back on I get excited, you might have noticed. And so I laid back on the side of the lake and I was looking at the sun setting behind the mountain tops. Which happens quite early in Canada. And then I noticed that, actually late in the summer, but I noticed that the sun was going behind the mountains, and a thought came to my head, isn't it cool how we always think the sun is going behind, but actually it's the earth that's rotating? And when I thought that, something hit me. Another thing hit me. I realized, these waveforms, dynamics, have to do as well with motion in space. Things move not in this up and down motion. And then I thought, wait a minute. And I thought of the solar system and it hit me. Typically, and if you have children, please, if they go to school, they're all going to get told that the solar system looks something like this. Let me try to erase this. Okay, that the solar system looks something like this. That the sun is in the middle, and the solar system, and in my school, we even had a little machine with a little thing, a little crank you spun, and the earth went around the sun with the moon and everything. And so they tell you, oh yeah, that's the sun, and then the planets go around like this in an elliptical course, and depending on the interaction of all the planets, it's either elongated or more round. Or you got all the planets like this in the solar system. Well, actually, that is absolutely incorrect. Okay? The thinking of the solar system in this matter is equivalent to thinking that the Earth is flat. The solar system does not behave that way at all. In fact, the solar system it behaves in a completely different way, since the sun is moving through space and the planets are flying around the sun, generating these huge vortices as it follows the equator of the sun. That is a completely different picture. All right? It goes from flat to spacious, to movement through space. And that makes a big difference. All of a sudden, you start to see that even planetary motions, solar motions around the galaxy, galactic motion, supercluster motions, and so on, all have this elliptical, vorticular dynamics of space. They all have this torque dynamic through space. And if you look at the Earth on this vortex, you could say that this is 2000, 2000 for instance, and this would be then 2001, and then this would be 2002, and this would be, this is extremely long distance apart. Millions and millions and millions and millions of miles apart. There's nothing in there, the planets do not come back onto their path. They don't. If they did, we most likely would have the same set of information over and over and over like a broken record. Okay? And we'd probably get real bored. It would be like Groundhog Year, And so, what makes, and so it hit me in my head, oh my God, what makes every second, every billionth of a second different from the other, every part of the division of space-time different from the other, and why is information changing, is because we are never moving back onto the same coordinates of space-time. We're moving through space-time, gathering information through the system and feeding it back and modifying the structure of space as we move through it. So it was really an important realization. It had implication in the physics I was writing, but as well it had implications in psychology theories and stuff that I was interested in because you could I've experienced and experimented on this since then where if I give this visualization to somebody and I ask them in their mind's eye to move the Earth back along that vortex to an instance, to something that happened in their life that was traumatic, I'm able to get these people to go back to that moment in much more vivid and much more powerful way. And then what I ask them to do is to change their visualization of that experience from their perspective to the 180-degree perspective, like to the perspective of the person that assaulted them or whatever. And then they get a new set of information. And what I believe happens is that new set of information is encoded in that place in space-time. And so all of the rest of the information is changed from there on. And that is actually the effect of psychology, asking you to go back to an instance. But if you don't know, and I think that's where psychology could get some help from this theory, is that if you don't know the true dynamics, the fundamental mechanics of that motion through space, you're going to try to visualize it in something that's going back in time on the same record, broken record, so you can't get there. Right? But here, I've had instances where people were able to do that and solve some very, very important issues immediately. And what happens is that if they're there in present time, then all the geometry that catch up with them now opens a whole new sets of geometry for them in the future. So that was really exciting. So I was on this bank of the lake, and I'm thinking, wow, I've got something here. I gotta think about. I want to do an experiment, to do something to be able to, show this. Am I correct? And I thought, how could I experiment to show a 3D wave instead of a flat wave? And I thought, okay, well, if I have a spinning motor that would give me the torque of space-time, and I attached a string to it, maybe I could, let's see what it does, you know. So I went back to my van, and I'm looking for an electrical motor. I couldn't use the V8 engine of my car. I was looking around, so I finally found one in the razor that I was using. It was an electrical razor. So I took the head out of the razor and I dislodged the motor. And then my razor was stuck in my experiment for a long time, so I grew a beard. I did. Here's me with the beard. And so, because I had no razor, and so my rope, I took a little fishing rope, and I took a little bit of a weight, you know, fishing weight that had a swivel on it, and I attached it to it, and I turned the razor on, and the result was so exciting. I was amazed at the result, because as soon as I turned it on, it went into coherent waveforms. And I used to go around physics talks with my little razor and my little string, going around showing people about a 3D waveform. And it was kind of funny. I'm going to demonstrate to you what happens when you spin and when angular momentum is applied to a string. And this is what happened here. So if I can have lights down, let me try to get this going. Okay. So here we are. And so we've got little motors that are going to spin this. And here's the coherent waveform. And here, with the strobe, I can stop the waveform that's actually a 3D wave. And can you, everybody see that this becomes a 2D sine waves? And that's how we visualize it. But actually, if I show you the whole thing, then you see that it's actually a 3D vortex, right? Spinning in space. So let me show you again. I gotta change the strobe frequency. There we go. And can you see how it becomes? It seems to be a sine wave, but actually is a result of a vorticular action of a rotating system. Here's a nice stable interference waveform. And interestingly, when you look at the central part of these waveforms, you can see structures that look like Mandelbrot fractal structures. And you can get much more complex one. Oh, this is a simpler one. This is a 2-wave. There's a 3-wave. I like that one particularly. There we go. Here's the sine wave in strobe stop. Can everybody see that? And then you can get, like I said, very complex interference pattern. That you would expect from wave dynamics. This is a stable one. There we go. Here's a pulse. Here's highly complex waveform. So, lights up. This is my string theory. And it's a toy, but I think that it's a toy that actually has a lot of significance in the way things work and how physics function. You know, just like a string from string theory, implies a lot of complexity in string theory, but it's only a string. Well, in here, you can start to see how the string, but I want to make clear here that I'm describing the string not in terms of some, esoteric 26-dimension theory, but actually as a structure of space-time torque itself, so that what we see is the electromagnetic field coming out as space-time torque radiating after it has been contracted into the system and forced angular momentum. And so that the feedback is continuous. And those lobe structures that are generated when the string goes into stable harmonics resemble very much the lobe structures that I was getting when the spheres are intersecting in this geometry. So I continued to explore these dynamics, and then I realized, well, sure, there was crop circles that looked that way, but one of the first supernova, I think it was the first supernova ever to be photographed, is supernova 1987A, and this picture was taken just as the action occurred, and it stunned astrophysicists all around the world that, when you expect an explosion of a star, you don't expect highly structured field to be generated like that. So it created a lot of stir in the physics community. And I got really excited because I'm like, wow, they took a picture of the geometry of space, my God. And I thought there was enough energy there that the plasma dynamics actually illuminated the dynamics of space that were going on. And I called my local astronomer, and he just told me I was nuts. And basically, he told me, oh, well, it was just a fluke. It's not going to happen again. Then a few years later, this one was taken. It's called the Hourglass Nebula. And sure enough, it did happen again. And now recently they've made new models of how this could happen. Why is this happening? And they found out that it actually in 3D, this is actually a double torus. It's like two toruses, and the reason is that the star blows off the top and the bottom. It follows the vortices. It's the easiest point of exit. And all the matter goes out and then goes out this way, and it expands a double torus, but viewed from various angles, it looks like so. And so that's very confirming. And I was really excited about it. And those supernovae dynamics, when you look carefully, are very interesting because you got this eye in the middle. And it's looking straight at you. And, when you look closely, it even has a little twinkle in the eye. And the twinkle might be because there's other gases of different densities that organizes in the middle. And here you can see actually a fractal structure. You see the orange first hula hoop are reproduced in a smaller fractal version in the middle of the system, and so on. So you're starting to actually see the fractal nature of the field there in different gas densities. And really, when you solve Einstein field equations with the torque, people could say, well, okay, but you're adding torque, but what's creating the torque? And the answer for that is that those equations are based on Laplace-Poisson earlier equation, which are equations of density. And what that means is that the density of the field is what drives the space-time torque. That is, because there's different vacuum density from infinitely dense to infinitely undense, but never absolute vacuum, then just like high pressure, low pressures of gases in our atmosphere generates a hurricane, then you get a galaxy, or you get a star, or you get a planet, or so on, because there's density change that drives the whole system. From infinitely dense to vacuum state, you know, in the extremely large. So you can see that these change that occurs in supernovae dynamics, they resemble very much what we just visualized with the little string ray machine. Here you get the same kind of dynamics. So here you get a hurricane, right? This is off the coast of Florida. And here you get a galaxy. Completely different scales, same dynamics. What do you find in the center of a hurricane? The eye of the hurricane, which is stillness, which is the vacuum state geometry, which is the place where it gets the coldest. And then at the center of the galaxy, you find the black hole, where past the event horizon, all thermodynamics are absorbed and so on, and you leave behind vacuum state geometry. So same dynamics at completely different scale should tell you something about that force and about these change of density. Imagine the change of density between galaxies, which in fact only brings molecules centimeters apart. And then the density inside a galaxy, which is much higher. And then the density inside the solar system, which is much higher. And then the density on the surface of the sun, which is much higher. And then again and again and again, because things are not homogeneous. They have different viscosities and different densities, which drives the space-time torque. This is a picture that was taken at the Sydney University of the energy levels, the energy dynamics around carbon atoms, molecules. And so here we see the same vorticular, dynamics of the space-time torque, according to my views. And we'll get into very high scales level. This is surveys that were done of superclusters of galaxies that's extremely large. And when they looked that far, they expected that things would be quite chaotic and not organized and so on. And instead they found the exact contrary. These very large scale structure organizes in octahedrons and tetrahedrons array way out there. And these papers are actually published in literature and called fractal or egg carton universe and stuff like that. That's what they're seeing out there. And basically, it's just like this. If you got your nose in the rug, if you got your nose in a Persian rug, there's no way you're going to think that there's a pattern to it. You're just going to think it's all chaotic. But if you get far enough from it, if you change your scale relationship, all of a sudden you start to see the pattern appear. And that is what I believe we're starting to see is the actual structure of space-time and how it organized matter. Even the table of elements. That was extremely large. Now we're going to much smaller atomic structures. Even the table of elements has been solved by Dr. Moon at the Chicago University to be able to solve for all the protons, neutrons interaction using the 5 platonic solids, very specific geometry, and then even all of the electron interactions using the Academian solids and the vector equilibrium and so on. This is Dr. Moon, the late Dr. Moon. Oh, well, that's one of the statements he did at the end of his life. We are entitled to seek a geometry of space, or in other words, we are no longer able to talk about empty space. That is, from his findings, he figured that there's got to be some geometry in space that's dictating those particle interactions. If you go even smaller, you're getting to the electron clouds and the orbitals, you find that these probability orbitals match very specific geometries that have to do with tetrahedron and octahedrons. The group theoretical models that predict subatomic particles are based on geometry. I mean, they emerged from crystallography. That's where these models came from, except that typically physicists ignore the geometry. They say, no, that's just a way to solve the equation. I believe that the equation is solvable in geometry because the geometry is fundamental to these particles' interaction. You have to have that geometry to be able to solve it. And, you know, we find that these interacting group theoretical models match the isotropic vector metric, the vector equilibrium, and so on. So now we're at the extremely, extremely small. Well, how does this come to this geometric structure? Well, if you study the Egyptians, the Mayans, the Incas, all these people, the Indians, you know, all these people, they all did this crazy geometry thing. And they talked about it in various ways. But what is most impressive is that they left very tangible things out there that had to do with geometry. And the things they left out there, if they were little models, you know, 3 feet high with, you know, easy to build, you'd say, well, you know, they must have instinctively figured this out, right? But if they leave behind something like this, it brings a whole new set of questions to the forefront. And that is, how were they able to pull this off? Okay? Listen, I know that you've heard a lot of stories from your schooling about how pyramids were built. And I know that they told you mostly that these pyramids were built in a very specific way, and that's a fact. That is, between, depending on the theory, 20,000 to 100,000 slaves or farmers that during the Nile flooding every year would go and build pyramids. And they built them, in, depending on the theories, between 20 and 40 years, you know, period. And all this. And that's all nice and dandy. And you have to realize that they teach this as fact. For instance, when you read in those books, it says, well, the pyramids were built by, not may have built by, nothing like that. It's like facts. And you think, well, that must be it, right? But when you think about it, those people that are writing these facts are not engineers. They're not physicists. They don't necessarily understand what it takes to build things. They don't necessarily understand how difficult it is to get great precision from building with stones. They don't necessarily understand that copper doesn't cut stone, and that so far copper hasn't been found to be able to be hardened to cut stone, and so on. So they just throw this stuff out there, and because they have PhDs and they're in the 1800s and they can't imagine of anything else, then everybody goes with that. And I assure you, if you're doing a PhD in Egyptology or in antiquity, in ancient civilization studies or so on, and you write a thesis that these were built in any other way, you're probably not going to get your PhD. And so I was really kind of stunned because I started to study it, because to me, I had solved a lot of these issues, but there was something that just kept on nagging at me. It's like, maybe the history of the earth, maybe the history of our civilization is quite different than what we think it is. And if that's true, I want to know why. Because then I could modify my view of evolution to match the true reality of what happened out there. And that could change a lot of things in the way I think of myself and my ancestors and the way things have been done and my place in the universe. So I started to study these things, and I tell you, when you start studying these things, just a little, and I'm in contact with a lot of physicists, so if I can't run the math, I can ask people their opinion and so on. And when you study these things just a little, right away, you're confronted with amazing, amazing data. For instance, the Grand Pyramid at Giza is 481 feet tall. It's built out of 2,300,000 stones in average, approximately. And the base of the pyramid is 13 acres square. Okay? When they placed the last stones on the top of the Grand Pyramid of Giza, which we don't have at this point. You see, the stone on the Grand Pyramid of Giza were ripped out. See, there was a covering on the stones all over the pyramid that was mined to build Cairo in the early 1900s and late 1800s. And so these stones were extremely perfect. The pyramids was much more perfect before. But still to this day, when you look at the immensity of the building and then you get satellite mapping of the apex of the pyramid, the apex is 1/4 of an inch off the center of a 13-acre square base. I don't know if we have builders in the crew here today, but I guarantee you this type of achievement, after having placed 2,300,000 stone, is not anything any engineering firm with all of the money in the world and the technology we have is able to reproduce today. I assure you. We cannot do that. We cannot reproduce that. You have to divide 1/4 of an inch by 2,300,000 stones to be able to get the accuracy of the placements of the stones. It's a very amazing thing. And then by the time they were done, the orientation of the pyramid to the stellar pole and so on, the way the pyramid is oriented and so on is extremely accurate, more accurate than many of our current buildings, including telescopes and such. The size, the enormous size of the building is beyond any comprehension, and there's another issue that's very, very dramatic. There is blocks in the Grand Pyramid. In the King's Chamber, there's 100 blocks of granite that have been hoisted to up to 130 feet of elevation in the Grand Pyramid and placed in perfect accuracy to create a relief of the pressure of the stones above with very amazing engineering, so that the whole thing holds together in a way that is unmatchable with all of our technology today. There's another problem, okay, in archaeology here. Archaeology is really the art of decoding text, decoding the remains of a civilization, and from these decoding, extrapolating their morses, their behavior, their day-to-day life, and so on. Well, if you follow that path, you would expect that somewhere in Egypt, after having placed thousands and thousands and thousands of hieroglyphs in all the temples and tombs and everywhere, okay, telling us everything about the behaviors of their morses, like what they ate, how they went to the washroom, what they did, and how they did it, and everything. I mean, they tell us everything, how they made love and everything, right? That somewhere somebody would have mentioned oh, by the way, we built the pyramids too. Don't you think? I mean, you'd expect that, right? But not one wall says that. Nothing in Egypt says we built the pyramids. Nothing in Mayan country says we built the pyramids. Nothing in Inca tradition says we built the pyramid. You know how they tell you that the pyramids were built as tombs. And these tombs were there to have the Pharaoh be buried into, right? You've all heard that. And you would expect that the reason they're telling you that is that they found mummies of pharaohs in pyramids. And typically when you look at the books or when you look at the reports from Egypt and so on, they typically show the pharaoh's tombs and then cut to the pyramids and show this all together in a way that you think that you're looking at this pharaoh tomb and it's in a pyramid. Well, it's a fact, however, that not one mummy was ever found in a pyramid. Not only in Egypt, but anywhere else in the world for that matter. Okay? In Egypt particularly, mummies were all found in underground vaults that have nothing to do with the pyramids. So when you think that a pharaoh that built this huge monument to have himself buried in it would at least put on the front, a little epitaph, so and so from this year to this year, we built this pyramid to bury myself, whatever. There is pyramids in Egypt that were completely sealed when they were found, including the Grand Pyramid at Giza. And the archaeologists, at the time almost treasure hunters, had to dynamite their way in many of these pyramids. They couldn't find an entrance. The entrances were plugged with immense 20-ton boulders that was so well matched to the rest of the pyramid, they couldn't find an entrance. So they would dynamite their way in, and in the case of the Grand Pyramid, they fell into a tunnel, and then they backtracked to the entrance, and then they could clear the plugs. And then typically, in some of these pyramids, they would get to the sarcophagus, and the sarcophagus would still be sealed. And it would have a slab of granite on top of it that weighed in excess of 20 tons. And they would lift the slab with great difficulties, unseal the supposed tomb, and find it empty. Completely empty. What was their conclusion? Tomb robbers got there before them. The tomb robbers somehow found the entrance, removed the plug, went in there, took all the treasures, removed the mummy body, lifted the lid, removed the body, took all the rest of the stuff, cleaned everything up, put the lid back on, sealed it back up, went back out, closed the plug, redid everything good, and walk out of there. I don't think so. And so there is huge difficulties in this. There is huge difficulties in these theories. Those are theories. They're not facts. And when you examine these theories, they have immense holes in them. Very large holes that involves thousands of tons of material. So for instance, you have things like the Sphinx. The Sphinx is right in front of the pyramids at Giza. The Sphinx, unlike a lot of people think, is not actually a built model, but is actually a carved statue carved right out of the Giza Plateau. And there's very interesting things. Now, if you were commissioned to build the Sphinx, what would you do? Now, you've got this huge plateau with this, very good rock in it to carve, and you would want to start carving. So you have to cut the enclosure around the Sphinx body to be able to carve the body. And what they did here is that instead of moving out of the enclosures, little blocks that you would see here, you see, out of the enclosure, if it was you that was commissioned, you'd probably remove 100-pound block, maybe 200-pound block, maybe 500 pound. If you have a good crane, maybe up to 500, 1,000 pound, maybe 2,000 pound. Why would you try to remove anything bigger, right? It'd be easier to deal with. You move things that match your level of technology. You don't move things that makes it difficult for you to move them, right? Well, the Egyptian somehow, supposedly, moved these blocks from the enclosure. Now, these blocks are known to have come out of the enclosure because the stratas on the blocks match exactly where the strata is here, and you can actually tell where each block goes. And these blocks weigh in the excess of 200 tons. Now these guys, seemingly 4,000 years ago, was moving 200-ton blocks casually, and not only just moving them, but stacking them. Okay? To create what is known as the Valley Temple or the Sphinx Temple in front of the Sphinx. Those are very, very disturbing pieces of data. They are not simply and easily dealt with or, pushed under the carpet. The Sphinx as well has all sorts of erosions on it that do have impact on our concepts of when the Sphinx was built or carved. New evidence has shown that the erosion that you find on the Sphinx body and then on the Sphinx enclosure, this is the enclosure from where the 200-ton blocks were relieved. The erosion that's seen here demands that there was large amount of rain for long periods of time to create it. We know historically and geologically that the amount of rain needed to create that type of erosion could only happen up to 10,000 years ago after the last ice age. That would mean that the Sphinx was not carved 4,000 years ago, but maybe up to 10,000 to 12,000 years ago. So now you have an even larger archaeological problem. You've got people 10,000 years ago going around with 200-ton blocks. It's a serious issue at that point. There is another temple that's a very important temple in Egypt that's not so well known and recognized, that is very well guarded at this time, that is an anomaly in Egyptian buildings. This is called the Osiris Temple. This is fresh from Abydos. And these blocks are polished pink granite in excess of 100-ton to 200-ton blocks stacked and organized into this incredible building. Now, look at the size of this block above his head. There are tongues and grooves. It's very highly engineered. you got to realize that we're talking about Egyptian here that's supposed to not have the wheel, they don't have the pulley, they don't have a crane to grab things and put them on top of things. Certainly not things that big. And this temple is typically as well a big controversy because, as you see, there's water on the bottom of it. It typically floods annually or almost all the time because it's below the Nile level. The temple is dug into the ground. So when the archaeologists first found it, they said, oh, the Egyptian dug and then built from there. But there's no other evidence in Egypt that the Egyptian would do that to build a temple. And when geologists look at the sides of the temple, they notice that the geological layering on the side of the temple would make it so that it's actually the other way around. The temple was there, and then the sedimentation from the Nile generated all the layers that eventually buried the temple. And then the archaeologists, lady archaeologists, found it and dug it out. Now, that would make this temple much older than previously believed. Like right now is being dated at about 4,000 years old. It would ask that that temple was there approximately 10,000 to 12,000 years ago. And eventually I came across these things that were thought to have been popularized now as the flower of life. Here's another picture of it. Again, those are fresh pictures. It's very difficult to find these pictures. You can study, I studied this temple all the way back to the original papers that were published on it, and I was never able to get one of these pictures. And actually really glad to have them now. And you can see them again. And so they're high on the pillars. And what's really amazing about this graph, this geometry that's imprinted on the granite, is that it's not cut, it's not etched into the granite, it's burnt into the atomic structure of the granite. It's burnt onto it like if it was laser burnt on the granite. And that poses a very large problem when you're thinking of 10,000 years ago, people going around burning stuff with lasers. Interestingly, when you take this geometry and you extrapolate it into 3D structures, now each circle becomes a sphere. The petals that we were discussing earlier, or the lobes we were discussing earlier, appears. And if you place a tetrahedron in each sphere, you get the 64 tetrahedron grid. The reason I'm mentioning all this is that there's evidence that there's people in this world that were able to do things in a manner that's completely different than how we do things today, and that exceed our capacity to do them today with all of our technology. Maybe, just maybe, because our technology is based on reactive, explosive technologies instead of contractive space-time curvature technologies, which would allow us to control gravitational fields and so on. These Egyptians had hieroglyphs as well that represented the highest level of initiation. The highest level of initiation that had to do with those sun gods. And these higher level of initiation always related, or typically related, to the eye of Horus. And when they use this hieroglyph in their writing, it's interesting to note that when they did, they used each part of the eye for a specific fraction of mathematics, and that each fraction went on towards the 1/64th fraction, which is the dynamics of the division of tetrahedron array in space. The other thing is that these 200-ton blocks were not their only level of achievement. This statue has been found in the middle of the desert, a few hundred miles away from the quarry where it was cut. And it's a statue, it's believed to be of Ramses II, I believe. And it has, it's a granite statue, extremely highly polished, that is made out of one block of granite that weighs in excess of 1,000 tons. 1,000 tons. These are very, very large anomalies. There's not just pyramids in Egypt. There's pyramids in many other countries, in South America and in Mexico and so on. And most people don't know, now remains of pyramids have been found in many other countries. This is Japan, underwater, near the island of Okinawa. These are the remains of pyramids that went under the water a very long time ago. What's great about pyramids that went underwater is that when they do, you get organic growth on it. See, when you're dating things, and you're using carbon dating, when you do so, you can carbon date things that have carbon in it that is organic life. So, for instance, when they carbon date pyramids in South America and so on, they say, well, you know, we'll carbon date this guy that was buried beside it, or we carbon date, you know, this campfire, or we carbon date what we find here, and then they extrapolate that these people were the builders of the pyramid. But when a thing like that goes under the water, then coral growth happens. And that is organic life. So you can carbon date at least when it went under the water. And when this was carbon dated, then it showed that this pyramid must have gone underwater 10 to 12,000 years ago, at the flooding of the last ice age. Now that would be when it went underwater. That is not necessarily when it was constructed. This is a picture of a pyramid that was found. It was found as a result of an error that a Second World War American pilot did while flying over China, and he came across this. He was lost, and he came across this pyramid and took a black and white picture of it. And it was published, and a lot of people screamed to hoaxes and everything. And I used to never show that in my presentation because there was too much controversy about it. There's over 100 different pyramids in China. And people in general don't know that. They're very, very large. Some of them, they're very typical. They resemble very much the pyramids of South America and Mexico. Here's a satellite picture of them. You can see them here. And interestingly, when you look very closely at the satellite pictures of the pyramids, you find that they resemble very much so what we find at Giza. This is China, this is Giza, and this is Teotihuacan off north from Mexico City. Same angles, same alignments, and all of these alignments match the stars of the belt of Orion. And that I find very interesting. Because many of the civilizations talked about these advanced beings coming from the Orion constellation and the star Cirrus. And so maybe they left us evidence of their passage. Now, when you go to the sacred sites of the knowledge of the sun gods from the Chinese tradition, you go to the Forbidden City, and at the entrance of the city, typically you have the Sphinx. The Sphinx, both in Egypt and in China and other traditions, is considered the guardian of knowledge and is usually placed at the entrance, and they guard the knowledge. And the interesting thing about those statues that guard the knowledge, in the case of the Sphinx, it's thought that the knowledge is guarded under the paws of the Sphinx. Now, interestingly, Edgar Casey said that we were going to find chambers under the paws of the Sphinx, and now with seismological equipment, they've been able to find chambers. They seem to be chambers under the paws of the Sphinx. But what's under the paws of this guardian? Well, when you look carefully, he's guarding the knowledge, which is a sphere with the lobes of the geometry of space embedded in it. And again, we find this information just percolating all around the world in these places where there's incredible buildings, incredible amount of knowledge. And, sure enough, these traditions in China are linked to the knowledge of the I Ching and the Yin Yang. And the Yin Yang is the torus viewed from above, as we saw earlier. And then the I Ching is made out of 64 symbols, each symbol being made out of 6 sticks, right? And the way you define each symbol relative to each other is that the sticks are either broken or full. And usually they are arranged in a circle, like so, where 1 is in opposition to 64, 2 is in opposition to 63, 3 is in opposition to 62, and so on. And each one has the same number of full stick and the same number of broken stick. It's just that they're arranged differently between 2 pairs. Now, I was looking at this, and again, I was in my van decoding this a long time ago, and I'm thinking, wait a minute, if I take 6 sticks and I put them together in a geometry, if they're the same length, then the only geometry I can generate out of those 6 sticks is a tetrahedron. And I thought, okay, that kind of works, so maybe the code has to do with tetrahedrons. But what would it be about the broken sticks? What are the broken sticks about? What's going on? Smaller tetrahedrons, what's going on? And it took me a while to figure this out, but eventually I realized that when you follow the code of the I Ching, it goes 164, and they're in opposition. So if you took 1, this is 1 here, and then this is 64, and you put them together, then the sticks have to intersect. And that's why you have the broken sticks, because when they intersect, they get broken. Bang, 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 bang. And here's your star tetrahedron structure. And so you can continue to build the I Ching, okay, and follow the code and continue to build the star tetrahedron structure with the positive and the negative and the positive and the negative. And by the time you're finished, you will have a 512 tetrahedron grid, which is just happens to be the next fractal level from 64. So then you have all the fractal, progression. It's very important. I mean, these are fundamental beliefs that we have around the world. They're very important traditions that have very important sets of data that are telling us about the structure of space-time, that are telling us about the dynamics of space-time. in 1972, Carl Sagan and a bunch of other astrophysicists figured, well, we've got the Arecibo radio telescope all set up now, so let's go out there and write a code and send the strongest signal ever sent into space so that we could, like, reach out to those people out there in the galaxy. Maybe they can capture this code and then send a reply. Now, that would still take hundreds and hundreds of years for that to happen, but it was worth at least doing it. So what they did is they got together and they figured, okay, what kind of simple code can we write? And obviously that's a binary code. And if you did a punch card of this code, it would look like this. And it says that we're made out of carbon. It says this is our table of elements. It says that's our DNA structure. And it says we have a small head, a big body, and we live on the third planet from our sun. And this is the technology we're sending this with, which is the symbol for a radio telescope. Well, nothing happened, obviously, because it would take hundreds of years for that to come back. But that's assuming that they're way out there. If they are close to us, orbiting, in our solar system, they would have got it very, very quickly. In any case, it wasn't until 2001, I believe, that the reply came back. Did you know that we had been talked to directly? Well, right beside a radio telescope that's typically hired by SETI to listen for extraterrestrial signals, a crop circle occurred in the middle of the night, right across from the highly secured gate, which has guards and infrared cameras and everything. And this crop circle came together, this reply punch card came together with a mugshot. Right? They thought we'll give them a little bit more than a binary code. This crop circle structure is very complex, not very easily hoaxed at all. If you look at the way the hay is woven into the field, it's very complex, very difficult to reproduce in order to get this face structure in it viewed from above. And as well, nobody saw anything there, and certainly there's security. And the reply is pretty straightforward, binary code. Now, when the binary code was decoded, it said something a little different from ours. It said that they were made out of carbon and silica. So, that's interesting. There's been people have been talking about becoming the crystal being, or, I talk about human beings as biocrystals all the time. But what is important here is what I found interesting is that since then, this data has come out that says that, in fact, it's not quite accurate to call ourselves carbon life. Because when you look into the fluids inside cells and inside the nuclei of cells, you find that there's actually more silica than previously believed, a lot more. And actually we're more like silica and carbon combined together. So maybe they were just being more accurate than us. And here they talk about their table of elements, which is very similar. And then their DNA seems to have one more strand to it. They have a big head, a small body. They live on 3 of the planets in their solar system, and the third one has 4 moons. And this is the technology that they're sending this with. And, I mean, this should have made the 5 o'clock news. But it didn't. And, it's interesting that the SETI comments on this was Well, you know what? The radio telescope was right beside it. So why didn't they just send a radio signal? Right? And if this is true, why didn't they just send a radio signal? And my reasoning for that, my answer to that is that, well, maybe they wanted the rest of the world to have the information. Because if they would have sent a radio signal, I assure you that stuff would have not made it on the local radio station. So this is really first contact. This is them talking back. Are we listening? Well, interestingly, when I looked at the bottom of that punch card, I was very, very intrigued, going, well, what is that technology down there? I'd like to know. Maybe it works with what I'm doing. And sure enough, you see, but you can't do anything with it because it's so low resolution. The code is so simple. So I couldn't really do anything with it. And then it was found that the exact same field in England, a year prior to this card, this punch card appearing in it, across the same radio telescope, they had given us the answer to what's at the bottom of the punch card. The exact same geometry. They had given the answer before we asked the question. The same radio telescope with the same security guards and all this. They didn't see nothing. And this, again, is a beautiful fractal division of space based on tetrahedral arrays. Again, here we see singularity, boundaries formation, and then duplication of the boundaries with radial expansion in a tetrahedron array. So we have huge stones that in some cases are found hundreds of miles from the quarry where they were cut. Extremely precise buildings all around the world. Ancient societies, oral and written traditions that talks about sun gods coming from the stars. And even today, thousands and thousands of very powerful evidence of unidentified flying objects. You might wonder, why are these beings not communicating with us directly anymore? Well, that may be because our society has grown to be quite violent. However, couldn't we learn from the information they left for us thousands of years ago? Is there evidence that these beings were here prior and that they left, or they left us to figure things out until maybe we evolved to a level where they could contact us again? These are the skull of Tutankhamun and his brother. This is the bust of Nefertiti, all showing elongated heads. Typically, in ancient Egyptian tradition, the sun gods had very elongated head, and the semi-sun gods, which were the progenitor of the normal humans having babies with sun gods, would have not so elongated head. This is a skull that was found in South America, in temples in South America. This is enormous in proportion and cannot be the result of binding of the head. The reason why that is not possible is that when you bind the head of a child so that you deform the skull features, then this binding of the head deforms the skull features but does not increase the volume of the skull cavity. In this case, the volume of the skull cavity is almost twice the size of a normal human being. Now, if there was only one of these that were found, you would say, well, maybe it was an anomaly, maybe it was a deformity. Well, there's all sorts of things that makes it not so. For instance, the jaw bones, the feature on the cheeks bones are not Homo sapien. They're more of the Neanderthal and mix of various evolution in the evolution chain that we believe is linear in evolution of man, and they shouldn't be all combined in the same skull. The other problem is that there's not just one of these skulls that was found, but multiple skulls that were found like this in temples around South America and Mexico. This one is a little bit different, as you see. It's not as pointed. Still enormous and still has some of these unusual features in their facial features and the jaw features. Others found in Mexico is these melon heads, where those actually have even a larger volume capacity inside the head, very large eye sockets, and a very strange structure of the skull. This is not the largest skull ever found. The largest volumic cavity of the skull occurred on this, that was found with this skull. And this is like the M kind of structure skull, where the hemispheres seem to have developed in independence, and very, very large skull. The front portion of the skull are missing, but the plates of the skull are all there, and they're very large in volume. So these are physical evidence you can touch of these beings having been around in ancient antiquity. You find them, stories about these beings, everywhere. You find them in Mayan tradition, Inca tradition. They both call them the sun gods. In the Egyptian tradition, in the Chinese tradition, calls them the sun gods as well. The Japanese tradition, pretty well all around the world. In the Mayan tradition as well, you find grids like so that have mathematical information on them that are thought to be calendars, very precise calendars about the changes in our solar systems, and interesting symbols that have these vortices that are interacting. And when you look at the math from these codes, you find that they match the 64 tetrahedron growth structure of space-time that we've been discussing all day. This is some of the oldest tradition on Earth. It has very, very ancient writing. These plates, this plate in particular, is a creation myth in which the sun gods come to the earth and gives man the black, it's called a black sun in those traditions. It's been translated in various other traditions, for instance in the Quran, as the black stone, okay? And it's described as a very highly radiating sun, like a sun in a box, like a desktop black hole. All right? And the tradition talks about the sun gods coming to the top of the mountain and the humans going to meet the sun gods, and the sun gods bestowing this on the human. Then you find in these Sumerian traditions that these eventually built very complex, very sophisticated. This is where we're actually bombing right now, Iraq and Iran location, where very, very sophisticated pyramidal structures were built, ziggurats and so on, that were very sophisticated building and very large building structures. This is a view from one of them from above. Many of those are being destroyed as we speak. Many of these artifacts in these traditions are disappearing in museums in those regions as we speak. If you look around those regions, you find other things that are large anomaly. This is one of the largest, most amazing anomaly we have on Earth. It is the stones that were the foundation of an ancient temple on which the Roman Empire erected a more recent temple. Afterwards, used the old stones as foundations. Let me show you the relationship of scale of these stones. This is a person, okay, and this is the stone. Okay, it's in approximately 22 feet of elevation and has been raised on smaller stones, still very large stone, but smaller stones that holds them up. There's 3 of them, okay, that are remaining there at this point. They're extremely large. In fact, they weigh in excess, these one there weigh in excess of 800 tons. Okay? And this one here, that's in a quarry about a half a mile from the temple there, okay, is in excess of 1,000 tons. Okay? Those are extremely large stones that seem to have been moved with ease in antiquity. And that doesn't happen very easily. Other artifacts are found around those region. In this case is a little pot that has an insert that's made out of copper and a little rod. And when you put the thing together and put grape juice in it, it becomes a battery. And it's evidence that they were using these batteries to electroplate things. And so the batteries were found, and they're from a certain epoch that makes them approximately 2,000 years old, except that there is electrolysis that was made on objects that were found that are much older than that, up to 4,000 years old. And these must have been plated with the same principle. So there's evidence that these people were using electricity at the time. Okay? And here's a little reproduction of one of these batteries, and they get about 1.1 volts out of it. And in series, you could use them to electroplate things and do all sorts of stuff. This is very ancient, advanced technology. One of these plates that talks about advanced mathematics has a set of geometric structure combined with these mathematics. And sure enough, when you look closely at this geometric structures on those tablets, which are, in fractal growth, they match perfectly the 64 tetrahedron grid when it's on its side. And here is the match. Amazingly, even with the little lines that go in the middle and so on. Perfect match. The tablets describes a geometric progression of the separation of space. Okay? So, all this is evidence, all leading to an understanding that there is, this is the Kaaba in the middle of Mecca. This is actually from my tradition. My grandpa was a guide that brought people from Iran to Mecca, and he brought the prayers of the one that couldn't go, because Islamic people all have to go to Mecca once in their life. And the ones that can't afford it, they're allowed to send somebody else. They always have these good, And so my grandpa was a person that would take the prayers of people and bring them to Mecca. He was a Bedouin. He ride on camel back, and it took 6 months there and 6 months back, so it was a long journey, and he would guide people there. And he went to this place very often, having this job, and more often than most other Muslim around our family, that's for sure. And my father has a news article from the Tehran press showing a picture of my grandpa with a small article, I think it was just after he passed, showing that my grandpa lived to the age of 128. And so, this is directly linked to my tradition. And when you read the Quran, you find that, again, in this Quran, in the Kaaba, in the middle cube there, in this geometry, in the middle of this beautiful temple where thousands and thousands of people come to rotate, to torque the field around it, right? And you find that it described that at the center of it is what they call the black stone, or the black sun. In the Quran, it says that it was given by angel Gabriel to Abraham, and that eventually ended up in the center of Mecca. Maybe we want to take one step back in order to make 2 steps forward. I'm talking about that. Let's assume that maybe because of all these anomalies around the world where people seem to have been moving extraordinarily large objects with what seemed to be extraordinary ease, that there was a time prior to our written history where on this planet, and prior to serious cataclysms that seem to relate to a flood story that is found around the world in over 500 different traditions, that there was this technology, this power source that allowed things to levitate, that allowed things to move about, that allowed information or energy to move through. And that this power source was given to us by advanced civilization that visited our planet thousands and thousands of years prior to our written history. When you do that, if you were a space traveler going through the galaxy and you found a planet that was very, very low in its technological growth, if they weren't too violent at the time and they didn't have too many means to be violent at the time, it would be easy for you to show up, most likely be thought of as a sun god or a god for certain, and give them, technology that could help them along their path. But what if that path of advancement was too rapid for this evolution? That is, the people that got the technology eventually weren't able to handle it because they hadn't learned enough lessons along their path. Well, you would have to take it back somehow and allow that civilization to grow again, reach that level where they would understand the responsibility that comes with advanced technology. And I'm convinced that that is the lesson we're learning right now.
Thank you for joining us today in Crossing the Event Horizon. Nassim Haramein's research is supported by the generosity of the public. To directly participate in this most crucial work, see our website for more information on how you can stay involved by visiting www.theresonanceproject.org. Thank you for continuing to spread the word about this exciting work and recommending this DVD to your friends and family. Be sure to watch the special features portion of this DVD.
So I go home in Whistler, right? And I was dealing with Stars of Davids and all this stuff. I knew that eventually I would have to go to my local church, and I got a Bible, and I started to study it, and I studied it, and I had very amazing experiences at the same time, and I started to study it in details, get different Bibles, different translation, and looked at the text, and I, all of a sudden, I realized that the Bible was not actually what I remembered it to be. Mostly because I was, as a young kid, I was studying the New Testament, but because it was Christian, but I started to read the Old Testament, and it was really amazing. I was reading it, and it didn't seem that my concept of the Hebrew God had been appropriately being interpreted by the Catholic Church, because I was remembering some guy on a throne somewhere with a beer, with a pair of binoculars and a 2x4 waiting for me to screw up, and I was very stressed about that. But the way I was reading the Old Testament, it was quite different. It didn't describe God in such a way. It described it in something much more close to what my studies were about. And I was stunned by that. For instance, in the Bible, you can find the description I've got as some kind of equilateral triangle on a throne, right? It had to do with geometry. And I was stunned by that. I mean, it wasn't an old man considering me as a sinner, but it was some kind of geometry that was described as the throne of God, the point of interaction between human and God. And there was various allusion to it in very specific parts of the Bible. And eventually I saw that they were describing as well these angels that radiated in this tetrahedron, and describing it as like crystal seas and all sorts of things that made me think of technologies and geometries and physics much more than some old guy with a beer on a throne. And I was surprised. That's not what I had remembered. And I continued to study it, and I realized that the Old Testament is ambiguous because the Old Testament described God not as something that's somewhere in the sky or anything. It describes God as an object. It describes that they have some kind of link or communication with God through an object that they call the Ark of the Covenant of God. And they weren't kidding about that. I mean, when you read the Bible and what archaeologists find, they actually built one of the largest temple in the world, the Temple of Solomon, to put this object in the middle. It was a very, very large temple with extraordinary large stones. And it was, this ark object had to be shielded from everybody else. And it was enclosed in this Holy of Holies, in the center of the Temple of Solomon, that was surrounded with concentric walls, very thick walls, in which initiates had to go through very specific initiation level to be able to go from one wall to the other. And only the few could ever go into the Holy of Holies. And they describe all sorts of things that happened if you went in the Holy of Holies or in the tabernacle without having gone through all the appropriate levels of initiation. If you weren't ready, it didn't seem like it was a pretty sight when you came out, right? And if you did. And so, I was intrigued with that. I was looking at many of these plates where they showed this ark object, this box that had gold on the outside, gold on the inside, and wood in the middle. And right away I realized that's got to be a capacitor. And sure enough, if you do a box like that, you can generate large capacitance. Capacitors are like batteries. They hold energy. They hold charge. And then the difference between a capacitor and a battery is that a capacitor can discharge extremely rapidly, where a battery cannot. And so capacitors are used in all sorts of electronics today. But basically, there are an electrical, a dielectric, and an electrical plate, which creates like a container for energy. So, and this large arc capacitor was described as having a sphere or a thing in the middle of it that was very radiant. Like, they describe how they had to shield themselves from it. And they had to wear very specific clothing to go in there. And that if they didn't, they would come out of there with a sunburn, basically, like burnt into their face, and so on. But then I kind of came across something. What happened is I thought, but wait a minute, they're calling this the Ark of the Covenant of God. And I was like, well, what does God mean? And so I was looking for an answer to that, and I did a lot of research, and I couldn't find exactly, this Yahweh and all this, and I couldn't find exactly, and then eventually I actually just opened the preface of my Bible by error or something. I started reading it, and I found the answer. And it says right here that the name Yahweh, the divine name Yahweh, YHWH, is currently the translation, or is used as the Greek terminology, the Tetragrammaton. Now, for a guy like me, when you are reading one of the most, sacred books on the planet, I guess, and the person is describing God, and the translation is Tetragrammaton, okay? I'm starting to have ideas. Can you, okay. You guys probably can see where I'm going there, right? I was stunned. Imagine that. Every time you read the word God in the Bible, you could translate Tetragrammaton. So you could replace all the gods and lords in the Bible to Tetragrammaton. And then you get a really different reading. Okay? It's like, oh my tetragrammaton. And so I looked at the etymology of this and I thought, well, the word tetragrammaton is typically, if you look at the root word, the tetra refers to four, right? The four faces of a tetrahedron. Typically, the translation is then done as tetra for four, grammaton for grammar. And grammar or letters is interchangeable, and so it's the four letters of God. Yahweh, Y-H-W-H. And grammaton was what was intriguing me, so I digged a little deeper, and I found that actually the word grammaton has a deeper root than grammar, in which it refers to the weight of an object, and that's where the word gravity and gram came out of. So all of a sudden, you could have a different interpretation of this word that says tetrahedron gravitation, right? Okay? Something along those lines, right? I know that might sound very, a long leap, right? But this was where I started. And I was really keen on continuing my research because it was promising. They were talking about tetrahedrons or triangles on the seat of God, and they were describing tetragrammatons for the force of God. And I was getting, inspired, to say the least. So I continued to research, and with this word tetragrammaton, I was able to look further and dig deeper, and I was intrigued. There's a lot of sacred societies that have a lot of information and all this. One of them, and certainly there seemed to be an oral tradition that was passed in the rabbinic tradition from one to the other throughout the ages, that wasn't allowed to be written. It's very clear in the Bible that the name of God or the source of God, whatever this God was not allowed to be just discussed publicly. It was very sacred, and it had to be transferred from one initiate to the other in very sacred way. And its traditions that transferred the information were called Kabbalistic traditions. So I started to study the Kabbalah and the Kabbalistic tradition and what they had to say about the Tetragrammaton. And when I did, I came across various esoteric manuscripts that we're going to see in a minute. But the other thing that puzzled me is that in many instances, the word Tetragrammaton and Ark of the Covenant and all this, in the description of what was going on there, it was describing something very interesting to me, because it kept on talking about the force of God, or the Tetragrammaton, having a vortex of fire or a vortex of clouds above it. And it describes it in the Bible in various instances. And it says that, that is where the power of God is manifest to man. And for instance, in this graphic, they show this is when the Hebrews were going through the desert for 40 years. They had a temporary tent system to host the ark in the middle, and they called the tabernacle. And they show here the vortex of cloud rising above the Ark of the Covenant that's in the back of the tabernacle. Just so you understand, this is the fire of sacrifices that are in front, and you see the smoke just dispersed. But in this case, it's very organized vortex type of smoke or clouds that orbit on the top of this object. From my previous studies and from my physics concepts, I had come to conclude that, for instance, the black sun or the black crystal described in other civilization may have been given by the sun god to humans as a very advanced technology, like a little sun in a box, a singularity created artificially inside a stone or a crystal that contained plasma dynamics spinning at high angular velocity, generating a torque in space-time, producing gravitational effects and energy effects. If that is true, then you would expect that on the top and the bottom of that structure, you would see vortices appear, columns of clouds or columns of light appear because of the high velocity of the space-time angular momentum along the side of that object. At the north and south pole of that object, large vortices would be produced. There's a chapter here if you want references, so you can look it up yourself in Numbers. It's called the cloud above the tabernacle, and it described that vortex cloud above the tabernacle. There's chapters where the sons of Aaron get struck by the Ark of the Covenant and die, and Moses is called into the tabernacle and instructed to never let anybody go in there without permission, because the vortex of the Ark of the Covenant, if it is not dealt with appropriately, can kill. There's all sorts of things like that happen in the Bible that, were striking. But the thing is that I started to realize that when you read the Bible, the Ark of the Covenant, this box-like object, was supposed to be built at the foot of Mount Sinai after Moses crossed the Red Sea. So I was confused because when I read the crossing of the Red Sea, I was struck that it said here, by day the Lord went ahead of them. They are going towards the Red Sea, fleeing from Egypt. It says, by day the Lord went ahead of them in a pillar of cloud to guide them on their way, and by night in a pillar of fire to give them light, so that they could travel by day or night. Neither the pillar of cloud by day, nor the pillar of fire by night left in its place in front of the people. So it's describing Moses following this vortex of cloud, and at night it would light up, this vortex of fire, through the desert going towards the Red Sea. But the description of the same vorticular action and the same description of this cloud thing, the cloud pillar, is given when it's describing the Ark of the Covenant. So I realized, wait a minute, maybe the Word of God, the information of God that was not allowed to be discussed, was the part about the source of the energy of the ark, not the box. The box was built afterwards to put that energy source in it so they could travel through 40 years in the desert. I started to think maybe these are two different objects. And Moses is following something, a power source, something that's creating a vortex in space, and it's coming out of Egypt. And then I realized, wait a minute, Moses was son of Pharaoh for 40 years, initiated in the highest level of initiation of the Egyptian, before he realized that he was Hebrew and left with the tribes of Israel. So if there was a power source, if the pyramids of Egypt were not just built to bury pharaohs, which I believe weren't built to do that at all, and were actually shielding device or resonating cavities, resonating space-time in a very specific geometric structure, but that they were missing their power source at the center. So I took the dimensioning of the Ark of the Covenant as given in the Bible. It's quite precise. And I got the dimensioning of the inside of the sarcophagus in the Grand Pyramid of Giza. And it was a perfect match. That is, if you have the Ark of the Covenant built, you will be able to lower that box into the sarcophagus of the Grand Pyramid of Giza, okay? And it will fit perfectly on the side and perfectly on the length so that you can lower it with the poles and push the poles in, which are telescopic on the Ark. And then I realized that the inside volume inside the sarcophagus is exactly half of the outside volume of that sarcophagus. Exactly, I mean, very highly precisely. And if you take the dimensions of the Ark, then you get exactly half the volume of the inside of the sarcophagus. And then if you take the dimension of the inside of the Ark, you get exactly half of the outside dimensions of the Ark. So you get perfect octaves of cavity, of resonance cavity inside the sarcophagus. So I started to think, maybe this object is not an Hebrew object. Maybe this object actually got taken out of Egypt by Moses when he left with the Israelites. And that might be a reason why after the king of Egypt, the Pharaoh of Egypt, allowed Moses to leave, all of a sudden realized that he was taking off with the power source and changed his mind and went after him. All right, that's very interesting. I'm starting to have a better picture of what's going on. I'm extrapolating, and I got some supporting evidence later. We'll see it, but I started to study ancient Egyptian texts to see if there was any evidence of that, and I found plenty. But one thing that struck me is that there's a story about a king of Egypt, a pharaoh, that's on a lake with his wife, and she loses a very precious, beautiful bracelet in the lake. And the pharaoh and the wife is quite distraught, and the pharaoh really wants to do something about it. And so the story goes to say that they call the high priest of Egypt, and they come and they open the waters of the lake to find the bracelet and give it back to the queen. And I thought, sounds like these guys, hundreds of years before Moses, were doing things similar to open the Red Sea. Now, imagine that you had the power of gravitation under your control. You could do things like stopping the course of water, okay, and opening channels. You could push things around. So I started to think about it, but when I read Exodus and the crossing of the Red Sea, I saw no evidence. It just says that Moses went to the front of the sea, raised his staff, opened his arm, and the thing opened, right? So I'm like, wow, that's some serious stuff you got going. And then I came across something that was much more descriptive. And that's typically lost by the scholars. In this in this chapter, it's called Joshua. In Joshua is much later after Moses. They've gone through the desert. Moses is now gone, is dead. And Joshua is in charge of the Israelites. And they arrive upon the Jordan, which is a large river, especially when it's running at flood level. And they mention in here that it is running at flood level. And they need to cross the river. And they don't know how to do it. At the time, there was no bridges. And so they are in a conundrum, and Joshua is instructed to take the ark and put all the high priests on the ark and then walk the ark into the Jordan. It's got the parting of the Jordan. And in this case, it's quite descriptive. It's quite amazing. It says, and the priests came out of the river carrying the ark of the covenant of the Lord. No sooner they had set their feet on dry ground than the water of the Jordan returned to their place and ran at flood stage as before. So here, it's quite very, very direct about using the ark to actually stop the course of the water of the Jordan, let the tribes of Israel go through, and then as soon as they got out of there, the gravitational field, or whatever you want to call it, allowed the water to start running again. One thing that's really omitted is the paragraph right after, or shortly after. Paragraph 23, for the Lord your God dried up the Jordan before you until you had crossed over. Remember, the Lord is the tetragrammaton described as the Ark of the Covenant. The Lord your God did to the Jordan just what it had done to the Red Sea when He dried it up before us until we had crossed over. In this paragraph, very specifically, it says that the reason the Red Sea was crossed and opened up is because it was the Ark of the Covenant that was used to do it. The reason why this is typically omitted is because all scholars believe that the Ark box was built after the crossing of the Red Sea at the foot of Mount Sinai. But the source power of that Ark box might have come right out of Egypt. And that might have been the power source of a technology much more advanced than anything we can dream of today. Alright, so now I was able to place that the ark had been used to open the Red Sea and then open the Jordan, and then later it's used to make the walls of Jericho fall, and then eventually is placed in the Temple of Solomon in the Holy of Holies, and is actually the center worship of all of these Israelites. Today, the rock on which the ark used to be in the middle of the Temple of Solomon is under the dome of the rock in Jerusalem, which is controlled by Islamic tradition. So, the Islamic tradition actually are controlling and consider that place a very holy place, because it said that that Muhammad ascended from that central place in the Temple of Solomon. So now you've got Islamic tradition and Hebraic tradition crossing over at the Ark of the Covenant. And these people have been fighting for so long. And so I continued to study, and something opened up. There's a whole set of information that opened up that we are not going to be able to go through tonight. We're going to go through some, but that leads from the Egyptian to the Hebrews to the Muslim, to the Templars, to the Middle Age, to modern age, to America, and right to the $1 bill. And that set of knowledge has been leading and powering our governments for a very long time. I think there is much more to what's going on that has to do with the search for this power. Eventually, I came across these things. They're called the Copper Scrolls. Again, Edgar Cayce, interestingly, in one of his esoteric reading, mentioned that scholars were going to find in the 70s, or I can't remember when, scrolls from a hidden society along the Dead Sea. Nobody really believed it. Scholars said, well, we know pretty well everything that was around there. There's no reason to believe there would be scrolls there or things like that. And sure enough, the Dead Sea Scrolls were found, hidden in caves near Qumran. And a whole society of priests that were unknown until then to scholars, and that seemed to have been very reclusive, very hidden society. In those Dead Sea Scrolls that were found in those caves, there is one set of scroll that was completely different than the other ones. Why? Because they were written on copper, not on typical hides or papyrus or anything like that. They were written on copper, and when the copper of these scrolls were analyzed, it was found that it is the purest copper ever found on earth. Alright? And when they decoded these scrolls, the way the scrolls are written, they're written backwards or upside down so that you were supposed to roll clay around them and then unroll, and then you'd have the clay tablet, which would have it right side up. But when they opened them, they didn't realize that, so many of them cracked. So anyway, they decoded them, and they found that the text on the scrolls describes the Ark of the Covenant coming to the Essene community of the Qumran region. The Essene that wrote these scrolls say to have had possession of the Ark of the Covenant. And it described 64 components of this that needed to be around the Ark in order for everything to be okay. So there's all sorts of components that have to do with oils, that you anoint yourself before you walk into the Ark room, with incense that has very specific herbs that you need to cleanse yourself with before you go into the Ark room. All sorts of components that came with the Ark of the Covenant. And not only does it describe these 64 components, it says where they hid them in the mountains near Qumran. When these scrolls were found and made public, it scared a lot of scholars because they thought, oh my God, this is like a treasure hunt. People are going to try to come and dig everywhere, and so there was a lot of publicity that these scrolls, although they were from that period of time and found with the other scrolls, may have been a hoax that was perpetuated then. And, just to throw everybody off, this was unlikely for many other people, and basically they were trying to discourage people from going to dig around out there. But a person was allowed to dig, and this person went through the channels. Is called Wendell Jones, and he dug in the Qumran region and eventually found one of the first item on the list, which was the oil that you had to anoint yourself, which increased conductivity on the skin, by the way, in order to go into the ark room. And Wendell eventually found a second item as well, based on the description that he was reading from these scrolls, and going into using the clues and finding them in the Qumran region. So let's take a look.
Wendell Jones is respected here and abroad as a credible Torah teacher. He has been featured as a speaker in Orthodox synagogues nationwide and has represented the Israel Foreign Ministry in a 2-year lecture forum on college panels in discussions with PLO representatives. Wendell was contracted by the Israeli government to write for their academic courses for tour guides at Hebrew University. In 1952, Wendell came across a news story that was to change his life. It was the account of the discovery of the Copper Scrolls. He was plagued by the realization that there were many anti-Jewish statements in the Gospels, and some were, as the marginal notes stated, omitted in more ancient manuscripts.
Did not surrender to be a preacher. I felt like I wanted to approach the Bible scientifically.
It is so fitting that the Shemen Afar Shimon should be the first item found from the days of the temple. When the pilgrims were ascending to Jerusalem, before they were in view of the Holy Temple, they would smell the fragrance of the Shemen Afar Shimon. The pilgrims knew that shortly they would behold the glories of Beit HaMikdash in the holiest of holy cities, Jerusalem, in the land of Judea.
Jones has been scouring the ancient caves of Qumran for the past quarter century.
The news of this discovery soon broke internationally, with coverage from CNN, CBS, NBC, and ABC. That following year, the October issue of National Geographic featured the find, followed by the December issue of Omni magazine, and countless other news sources carried the story worldwide. In the spring of 1992, the authenticity of the Copper Scroll was further enhanced with the discovery by Institute teams of a silo in the bedrock containing some reddish material, organic in nature. It was analyzed by the Weizmann Institute and 2 departments at Bar-Ilan University in Israel. The testing indicated the reddish material was a compound of 11 ingredients found in the Ketoret.
I have absolutely no doubt this material is Pitum HaKetoret.
This was the Holy Temple incense.
If we continue to find the items listed in the Copper Scroll and continue to locate them in the order that they're listed in the Torah, then the next thing we should find is the ashes of the red heifer. All things will be restored, as even the Torah that Moses broke. Remember, he placed them back into the ark, and God restored them. Moses wrote a Torah like the stones in the ark. Christian art has pictured the Torah as 2 tombstones, but that's not how they're described. In the book of Exodus, chapter 32 and verse 15, we read, "And Moses went down from the mountain with the 2 tablets of testimony." In Hebrew it reads, luchot, not slabs, but sapphires. These were dihexagonal shaped like the sapphire molecule.
That last part is really important. Is revealing information that doesn't quite match the Christian interpretation of the Torah, where Moses is not said to have come down from the mountain with tablets with the 10 commands on it, but actually sapphire type or crystalline type of structures that were hexagonal in nature. When a guy like me hears stuff like that, the fact that Wendell Jones has been able to find and locate these things in the mountains of Qumran supports the concept that the ark was a true object. That this is not just some crazy story from an ancient book, but actually that this really happened. And that the civilizations or the communities at Qumran had access, in any case, had at one point or another the Ark of the Covenant in their midst. Now, how could that be? Well, it's found that, imagine that you had an object of extreme power in the center temple, and this might make you understand a little more why all these wars have been raging in that section of the world for so long. Imagine that you had this amazing power, this amazing object at the center of your temple, but that your town, your city, your defense system could fail. And this object could fall in the hands of other civilization that wouldn't necessarily understand how to deal with it. You would have, I'm sure, an exit plan, a B plan. And I believe that their B plan was they had a community of high priests fairly far away from the temple, that where high priests were constantly being trained in the order to be able to handle the Ark of the Covenant. So that if anything happened at the temple, the Ark would be swiftly taken out through underground tunnels, and many of them have been found now, that would bring them out of the city and bring it to their temple, to their place, so that they could handle it there and keep it safe. And that might be why no writing about that community was found by scholars for a very long time. Nobody knew they were there, either than this Bedouin that threw a rock in a cave, heard a pot break, and thought there may be something in there, and eventually found the Dead Sea Scrolls. So, all of a sudden, it starts to make sense, and I was getting a better picture of what might have happened. Now, interestingly, there's new evidence that's coming out, and well, there's a few things. One of them is that most of the writings of Qumran, most of the Dead Sea Scrolls, are not allowed to be released to the public. Only, I believe, 100 scrolls have been released to the public, and the rest is not has not been released to the public at all. I find that interesting. I wonder why. But certainly, the fact is that there is evidence that Joseph and Mary, the parents of the one that was actually called Emmanuel in the Bible, the name of Jesus came later on, but in the Bible it's very specifically said to be Emmanuel, were Essene and were from the Essene community. So imagine this child coming into the field of this extremely powerful object and growing into the field of it. Imagine having an object that is like a transducer for the power of space-time, all the information of the universe in that point. When you're close to it, there's a lot of information transduction that's going through your DNA. That could make you be able to do things that the average human beings cannot do. It's like a little torque on your space-time reality. All right? And certainly, walking on water is evidence of gravitational effects.
At a recent press conference, famous videographer James Cameron and filmmaker Simcha Jakobovicki presented a controversial documentary called The Last Tomb of Jesus. The research reports on an ancient family tomb found under a construction site and documented by archaeologists in 1980. The controversy comes from the cluster of names that was discovered engraved on some of the ossuaries. One of the most prominent inscriptions reads, Joshua, son of Joseph, or Jesus, son of Joseph. Another bears the inscription Maria, or the modern Maria, and yet another read Marianni Mara in Greek, which may correspond to Mary Magdalena, as Marianne is the name found in the Acts of Philip to describe her. Though the names found on some of the ossuaries are common, it is significant to find all of these names with biblical references clustered in the same family tomb. More significant for our purposes is that it seems that many ossuaries of the first-century Judea Christians bared a very specific geometric configuration. For example, the ossuary marked Marianni Mara bears very defined geometric decorations that in the context of our research have extreme significance. Indeed, once again we find the very structure of the cube octahedron, or vector equilibrium, engraved on an ancient artifact. It is even carved in such a way that the lobes or petal structures of the matrix are apparent in 3D. The same typical geometry is found on other ossuaries, one of which is marked Judah, son of Joshua. Certainly the claim that Mary Magdalena and Joshua may have had a child is controversial, but the symbols that are found on these ossuaries and others from the 1st century AD have striking significance. It is as well significant to note that both the one called Joshua or Emmanuel and Mary Magdalena were in some traditions considered to be a representation of the living ark. These symbols, as well as we have seen earlier, are found in many different traditions, and specifically in the Egyptian Osirian temple. This temple is associated with the resurrection of Osiris, with the help of his consort Isis, and may denote the structure of space-time and some of the most powerful and profound knowledge of the time. Significantly above the entrance of the tomb was a unique facade, a carefully crafted chevron and circle that mystified the archaeologists. In the words of Dr. Shimon Gibson, one of the archaeologists present at the opening of the tomb, there's no doubt about it that those symbols meant something. It's unlikely that the family or the person that came and carved out the tomb just carved these things at random. They had to symbolize something. What they symbolized, I don't know, but it's quite rare to find that kind of ornamentation on a simple tomb. Interestingly, thousands of years prior, at the beginning of the Pyramid Age, a mysterious conical stone, deemed to have cosmic origins, is found in ancient Egyptian traditions. The Bin stone was housed in the Temple of the Phoenix and was associated with regeneration, rebirth, and celestial cycles, and was thought to be the divine seed. The Bin stone disappeared long before Herodotus, an earlier Greek historian, visited Egypt, but not before it had relegated its name to the apex stone placed on top of pyramids or obelisks. One such example was found from the pyramid of Amenemhet III and is housed at the Cairo Museum. It bears the inscription, King Amenemhet III sees the beauty of the sun. He sees the Lord of the horizon sailing in his boat over the sky. Would this be the Lord of the event horizon flying in his ship in the sky? Interestingly, this most sacred object is almost a perfect match to the so-called chevron found at the entrance of what may be one of the most significant archaeological discoveries of our time. The chevron and circle is typical of the symbology of the ancient Egyptian all-seeing eye. Again, we see that this most important symbol in the Egyptian tradition was used to describe a fractional series from half to the magic fractional structure 1/64. The symbol is as well found as representation of ultimate power on the top altar of Mayan temples and is depicted on walls in various ancient locations of the Americas.
I continued to study some more, and I realized that tetragrammaton in Kabbalistic tradition is typically denoted or described as this triangle structure with in this case, the letters of God in it. And if you actually look at the way the letters of God are laid out in it, it's like an isotropic vector metric. Okay? So 1, 2, 3, and 4. There's 4 layers to the isotropic vector metric. If you took the first layer here, you'd have 1, 2, 3, 4 on the bottom, 3 in the middle, 2 here, and then 1 on top. Just like the way these letters are laid. And the Kabbalistic tradition are very clear that you shouldn't take the letters at face value, that actually each letter has a mathematical number attached to it, and that it's the numbers that have a meaning as well. So if you look at the numbers of the Tetragrammaton, then it's 10, 5, 10, 6, 5, 10, and 5, 6, 5, 10, and they all add up to 72. And sure enough, in the Bible and various texts, you find that the number of God is 72, or the number of faces of God, or the great name of God is 72. So it all works. It's really nice. The thing is that this is only a male God. It's missing its better half. Remember? It's missing its polarity. And so, imagine that you wanted to leave a code on a planet that's not so evolved, but you wanted to leave the code so that it would give them great power at an important time in history. But you wanted to make sure that it could not be decoded until they were ready for it. How would you do it? When maybe one way you would do it would be to give the code in a polarity way, so that you would have to have a civilization come to the realization of the equalities of polarity before they could decode the code. So, and that would most likely be a society that's ready for that type of power. So, when you take the male Tetragrammaton and you add the female one, or the positive and the negative one, then you have to add a second isotropic vector metric. So the result is that you would have to double this number. 72 twice is 144. 144 is in the book of Revelation as a very important number for the new and the changes of the new world. When you put 64 tetrahedrons together and you get this fractal vectorial array, you get exactly 144 faces on its outside surface. And so that was getting compelling. But the Kabbalistics didn't stop there. The Kabbalistic traditions said, well, actually, if you want to truly understand the power of the Tetragrammaton, the power of God, if you want to understand the root of creation, you must decode this tree, which was thought to be the tree of knowledge, which is analogous to the tree at the center of the Garden of Eden. This was thought to be the foundation of creation, and that if anyone could decode this, they would hold the key to creation. There's a lot of writing in Kabbalistic tradition that says as well that it shouldn't be attempted to be decoded. Because most people that have gone crazy. And so I took those warnings seriously, and I thought, well, I'm most likely already crazy. Well, I live in a van, you know. I'm studying all this crazy stuff. I must be okay, you know. It won't hurt me that much. So I went at it. And I studied and I studied and I studied and I tried to figure it out. And I couldn't really figure it out. I was really bugging on it because it was getting so complex. So many texts I was reading about this were so complex and so philosophical, and they had all these realms and dimensions and all this. I couldn't figure it out. And then I decided to draw it, and I plastered it on the ceiling of my van so that when I would wake up in the morning, I could just stare at it and try to figure it out. And so I'm in the van in the morning, and I look at it, and then, fairly rapidly I realize that there's a tetrahedron on the bottom of it. Okay? This part here is a tetrahedron, if it's seen in 3D. And then I looked up here, and I realized that in 3D, those lines would generate as well a octahedron. See, the thing is that most people don't see this thing as a 3D object. So flatten it makes not much sense. But in 3D, it describes very specific geometry. So because I had this type of 3D mind, and I was always very intended on not doing the flat thing, I was trying to visualize this in 3D. But I couldn't figure out this middle box thing. I just couldn't figure it out. For weeks, months. Just like, laying in my bed looking at this thing. And studying and all this. And then one day, I said, wait a minute. I realized that one of those boxes in the middle here, okay, matches the box in the top portion of the octahedron. So I thought, what if I slid the middle part box in the upper box and see what it generates? So I split them in two, and then I slid the bottom part into the top part. And when I did so, it was like a key, right? It just locked in and generated all the vectors necessary to have a tetrahedron and an octahedron, one on top of each other. So now I had all these vertices for 3D geometry. These are the only geometry necessary to produce a 64 tetrahedron grid. So I knew I was close. So I got really excited, and I continued studying and intensely studying, and I realized something is that the Kabbalistic text doesn't say there's one tree at the root of foundation, the foundation of the universe, or at the root of the universe. There is 4 trees at the root of the universe. And they said that the 4 trees were attached at the same root. Now I thought, well, wait a minute. Maybe they're still giving us only half the code. Maybe there's 8 trees, and they're only giving us the polarity, the half polarity of the code. I looked at my structure again that I had come up with from sliding the bottom into the top, and I realized I had extra lines. And these extra lines match the lines to generate the star tetrahedron. So if I got all the branches of the tree, and then I attach the 8 trees together, I would have 8 star tetrahedrons coming together to generate the 64 tetrahedron grid. And what Ptolemy had decoded this right was that by the time I was finished, I could now plaster the Kabbalistic tree right over top of the 64 tetrahedron grid and get all the 9s of the 2D tree out of the 3D geometry. It worked. And hooked all together, it generated all the intersection necessary to build a 64 tetrahedron grid. And when I calculated this, then I saw that it could be done in many different ways. But one thing that was for sure, the Kabbalistic text said actually there's 10 spheres, they're called sephirots. And they come from the word sapphire. Okay? So actually it's talking about crystals again. And it says that these sephirots are the joints between the pathways of creation. And it said that there was this 10 sephirot to one tree, but because they're all hooked to the same center, to the same root, which is called the crown sephirot, which is described as a point of indwelling where God falls or God goes towards infinity. Okay? Basically describing a singularity. When they say that, they say that one doesn't count. So you get 9 sephirot per tree. Well, if you have 8 trees and you've got 9 sephirot per trees, 8 by 9 is 72. And now you're right back to the 72 powers of God. And the code has brought you all the way back to the beginning in a feedback loop of coding information. And so I continue to find the solution to this. We did a small animation on how the trees come together, and it's literally the trees compressing together, creating that collapse into singularity, generating the code. It's quite amazing. Then it generates all the joints necessary to produce the 64 tetrahedron grid. So I wrote a little thing on this. It's an old book I wrote. It was all my findings on ancient civilization. I didn't write anything on. I wrote some physics in there, but just layman physics because I wasn't prepared yet for that. And the day I was writing this part of this little booklet that some people here have, that day, while writing this, I decided to log on to the net and look at what, is happening in the crop circle world. And sure enough, that crop circle occurred that day. That was freaky. So it really, was an amazing journey through this information of the Bible and the codes of ancient civilization all around. And I really was taken by it. And it was so confirming, and it just took, and every step of the way, it just kept on confirming. And, in this short presentation, yeah, I don't have time to go through all the details. I do give week-long presentations where, we have time to go through all the details of things. And even then, in a week, I usually still run out of time. But there's so many of this amazing confirmation that came along the path. Every step, every time I would doubt, something else would come out and grab me. and show me the way. And and it brought me to a very different view of not only our past, but our possibility in the future, and how we move from here to the next level, how this change that so many of us are feeling on the planet is going to occur, and how we can help it, and how we can help ourselves through it. To this day, I'm finding stuff. I mean, it's amazing. There's so much stuff out there that relates to this. It's almost like there's nothing else. And in case of this being correct, then there isn't really anything else. There is this amazing structure of the vacuum that generates reality as we see it, that generates our existence, and it basically oozes out of us throughout our civilization, throughout our understanding, throughout our physics, throughout our advanced thinking, and it really brings us to a different way of relating the world. And in this way of relating into the world, and that's where I believe that the New Testament and the Old Testament comes together. Because I believe that the Old Testament is talking about very advanced technology, and that the New Testament is talking about where you have to be in being able to have this level of technology. And that when the two come together, then you have a complete being, you have a complete master, you have a civilization that has reached levels of masteries in which they have an equilibrium between their external world and their internal world. They have understood that they hold singularity, that they are in contact with the universe within their existence, even within their physical existence, which is made from subatomic mini black holes connecting all things together. And from that perspective, a civilization would build a completely new sets of technology, a completely new set of interaction in its civilization, of relationship with each other, and certainly realize their common goal and their common aspiration. I always say this, this model tells us really that the surface of a planet is like an event horizon from which each individual is a little sun ray, right? And that sun ray has a very specific vector direction in space in which it gathers a very specific set of information. However, all of our feet are pointing to the same singularity, to the same center, and connecting us all. And that singularity holds us on the surface of this planet as our gravitational field. And if we get to this, I believe we can develop technology out of this that will bring us to the stars. And I think, that's my understanding at this point, that this is the crucial time to be able to transcend our way of doing things to the way that we need to be able to do things in order to survive the changes that are coming into our solar system and move to the next level of interaction, and maybe even connect with other civilizations that have been in our galaxy, that have been observing us, that have been waiting for us to graduate and enter a larger community, a larger galactic community, and move on from here. So, thank you very much for all your attention today. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you for joining us today in